One cold morning, a woman opened her front door and found a newborn baby left on her doorstep with nothing but a note and a name. She took him in, raised him as her own, and gave him a life full of love. But 18 years later, that same boy came back with a truth so unexpected, it would turn her world upside down and bring long-buried secrets to light. This is a story about love that chooses, not just blood that binds. A story of second chances, healing, and the power of family. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from and leave a comment below. Helen McCarthy had lived alone in her modest two-story house on Maple Lane for nearly a decade. It was the kind of home where the porch light always glowed warmly, even in the dead of night, and the garden bloomed year-round with tulips and roses she tended like children. Her neighbors knew her as the retired schoolteacher with kind eyes and a soft voice that carried the patience of someone who had spent 40 years coaxing answers from uncertain students. Life had slowed since her husband Walter passed, leaving behind only memories and his favorite rocking chair on the back porch. Her days were peaceful, predictable, wrapped in the quiet routines she'd come to find comfort in. Until one morning everything changed. It was just past 5. The sky still caught between night and day when Helen was roused by an unfamiliar sound. 3 soft knocks. Not the firm, urgent kind. These were hesitant, almost afraid. She sat up, in bed, heart thudding. No one knocked at her door this early, not in a town like Willow Creek. She slipped on her robe and house slippers, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet as she made her way to the front door. For a moment she paused, her hand on the doorknob. Then came a 4th knock, softer than the rest. She opened the door. There, on her porch beneath the soft halo of the porch light, was a basket. Inside the basket lay a baby, wrapped tightly in a faded blue blanket. Helen blinked, stunned. The baby didn't cry, only looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. Pinned to the edge of the blanket was a small, crumpled piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. In shaky handwriting, the note read, "Please take care of him. His name is Daniel." Helen looked up and down the street. Nothing. No footsteps, no car engines fading in the distance. The world was still and silent except for the birds beginning to stir in the trees. She bent down slowly as if afraid the child might disappear, and gently lifted the basket into her arms. The baby let out a small coo and then, as if reassured by her presence, nestled into the blanket and closed his eyes. She carried him inside and placed him gently on the sofa. The baby's skin was soft, his cheeks round and pink. His hair was fine, just a whisper of downy brown fuzz. Helen stood over him, still in disbelief. Who would leave a baby like this? Why her? Her heart, still raw from years of missing Walter, thudded painfully in her chest. She should call the police, she knew that. It was the right thing to do. But instead, she sat down beside the basket and just stared. She hadn't held a baby since her niece visited nearly 20 years ago. Yet, something in her arms had remembered. Something in her soul had awakened. She picked up the phone and called 911. The dispatcher was calm, professional, told her an officer would be there shortly. When the doorbell rang 20 minutes later, Helen opened the door to find Officer Grady, a kind-faced man in his early 40s who'd once been in her 6th grade class. He looked surprised to see her and even more surprised when he saw the baby. "Someone left him?" he asked, his voice hushed. Helen nodded and handed him the note. He read it carefully, then glanced down at the baby, who was now sleeping peacefully. "We'll have to take him in, ma'am. Protocol. Child services will—" "No," Helen said, her voice steady. "Not yet. Let me keep him. Just until you find out who left him. He's safe here." Grady hesitated. "You know it doesn't work like that. But I'll make some calls. Maybe there's something we can do." He paused. "You always had a way of getting people to do the right thing." By the time he left, the sun had risen. Helen sat in the rocking chair in the living room, the basket beside her. She rocked gently, watching the baby sleep, a soft hum rising from her lips. She couldn't explain it, not even to herself. But she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, of possibility. Her heart, once so quiet and careful, was now stirring with a strange new courage. That night she didn't sleep much. She kept checking on the baby, rising every hour just to see him breathe. She cleaned out the spare bedroom, the one that had once been her reading room, and began converting it into something softer, warmer, something that might one day be called a nursery. By morning, she had already made a list of supplies: formula, diapers, bottles, tiny clothes that would fit his little frame. She drove into town, and though people stared, small towns never missed a thing, she held her head high. No one knew where the baby had come from, and Helen had no answers to give. All she knew was that someone had left a child on her doorstep with a name and a plea, and somehow, impossibly, that name already felt like a part of her. Daniel. She whispered it to herself as she stood in the checkout line, her cart full of baby things. Daniel. She didn't know then how much love, pain, and joy would come from that single moment on the porch, but something deep within her already believed that life, with all its unexpected turns, had brought him to her for a reason. The knock that came before dawn wasn't just a sound at the door. It was the opening of a new chapter in her life, one she hadn't even known she was waiting for. Helen stood at the edge of the nursery, sunlight filtering through lace curtains as it cast warm patterns on the freshly vacuumed carpet. The old reading room had transformed almost overnight. The bookshelf, once filled with dog-eared novels and faded teaching guides, now held soft toys and pastel-colored picture books. She had even unearthed the antique cradle from the attic, the one Walter had built for their nephew decades ago. It rocked gently in the morning breeze that slipped in through the open window, creaking like a lullaby from another lifetime, and nestled inside that cradle, little Daniel slept, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the quiet peace of the house. Helen watched him with a mixture of wonder and fear, the kind of fear that only comes when something precious is placed into your care without warning, without preparation, and you feel the weight of it deep in your bones. She had told Officer Grady that she wanted to keep him, for now, but what did that really mean? She wasn't his mother. She wasn't young, and she wasn't sure how long for now might last, but there was something about the way he clutched her finger in his sleep, something about the way her heart softened in his presence, that made her decision feel less like a choice and more like a calling. Later that morning, Grady returned with someone from Child Services, a no-nonsense woman named Valerie Moore with sensible shoes and a clipboard that never left her hand. Valerie sat in Helen's living room, eyes moving between Helen and Daniel with a look that tried to be kind but couldn't hide the skepticism behind her glasses. "You understand, Miss McCarthy, that this is a temporary situation," she said, pen poised above the forms. "Custody cannot be granted without a proper evaluation. We'll need background checks, home inspections, and court approval." "I understand," Helen replied, her voice calm, steady. "But I want to be here, for him, until you find whoever left him, or until someone else comes forward who can love him more than I can. But I warn you, that won't be easy." Valerie cracked a thin smile, the first of the morning. "That's quite the promise." It's the truth. In the weeks that followed, Helen's life changed in ways she hadn't imagined possible. The days of quiet tea on the porch and solitary crossword puzzles were replaced by feedings, diaper changes, lullabies, and late-night pacing across creaky floorboards. Her house, once so still and silent, was now alive with coos, cries, and the delicate symphony of baby life. At the supermarket, people stopped to peek into the stroller and ask, "Is he your grandson?" She would smile and reply, something like that. No one pressed too hard. People in Willow Creek were polite like that, but whispers grew like ivy on an old wall. Still, Helen kept her chin high and her steps steady. She had nothing to explain. Every Friday, Valerie would visit for her check-ins. She asked questions, took notes, examined the cleanliness of the nursery, and even inspected the safety of Helen's stair railing. At first, Helen felt as if she were under a microscope. But over time, Something shifted. Valerie's tone softened. Her questions grew more personal. One afternoon, as Daniel dozed in Helen's arms, Valerie looked up from her clipboard and said, "You're doing a better job than most young mothers I see." Helen chuckled softly. "Maybe it's the teacher in me. Or maybe it's just love." The truth was, Helen had fallen in love with Daniel in a way that felt both terrifying and miraculous. She knew it couldn't last, at least not unless something changed. The investigation into his origins had turned up nothing so far. No fingerprints on the basket, no surveillance footage, no missing infant reports that matched his age or description. It was as if he had appeared from thin air, placed into her life by fate itself. Each day that passed made the uncertainty harder to bear. She found herself hoping that no one would claim him, and then feeling guilty for hoping. One evening, after she'd tucked Daniel in and the house had settled into a rare moment of silence, Helen took out the note that had come with him. She kept it folded inside her late husband's Bible, underlined with a ribbon where his favorite psalm still lay marked. The note's edges were curling now, the ink smudged from where her fingers had traced it too many times. "Please take care of him," it read. "His name is Daniel." That was all. No date, no signature, no explanation. She read it again, as if it might suddenly tell her something new. And for the first time, she prayed aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet of the room. "Lord, I don't know why he came to me. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, but please let me keep him, let me love him." The next morning brought a surprise. Valerie arrived earlier than usual, her expression unreadable. She sat down at the kitchen table while Helen poured her coffee, her hands shaking just slightly. "We still haven't found anything," Valerie said. "No leads, no claims. It's like he was never born." Helen waited, her breath held. "But," Valerie continued, "because of the care you've given him, and given your history and your background, if you're willing, we can begin the process for you to become his legal guardian." Helen's breath caught. She looked toward the nursery where Daniel's mobile spun slowly above his crib. She turned back to Valerie, eyes glistening, and nodded once. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." And in that moment, Helen's decision became something more. It became a promise, not just to a child abandoned on a doorstep, but to herself, that no matter what had brought Daniel to her, she would be the one to give him a name, a home, and a future. She had chosen him. But somehow, in a way she couldn't quite explain, it felt as though he had chosen her too. Raising a baby at 67 wasn't something Helen McCarthy had ever imagined. But life has a funny way of giving you what you didn't ask for, just when you need it most. The days with Daniel were long and sometimes exhausting, but they were full in a way that filled the quiet corners of her heart. She began each morning with a bottle warming on the stove, soft humming as she rocked him in the early light, and ended each night with lullabies whispered into the hush of a house that now breathed with life. Her friends thought she was out of her mind. "Helen, you should be relaxing, not changing diapers," one had said at the grocery store, raising her brows over the cantaloupes. Helen had just smiled and shrugged, her hand resting protectively on the stroller handle. "Relaxing is overrated," she'd replied. They didn't understand, not really. How could they? They didn't wake to that gummy smile or the way Daniel reached up for her like she was his entire world. With each passing month, Daniel grew stronger, louder, more curious. He learned to crawl with a determination that made Helen laugh, tumbling his way across the living room rug like a wind-up toy. When he pulled himself up using the side of the coffee table, beaming with triumph, she clapped and cheered so loudly that the neighbor's dog started barking. There were trips to the park, first in a carrier snug against her chest and later toddling along the path with chubby fingers curled around hers. He loved birds and flowers and watching the wind ripple through the trees. And Helen, in turn, loved watching him discover the world like it was a new story unfolding just for him. At night, she would sit in the old rocking chair by his crib, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest as he slept, his lashes resting like feathers against his cheeks. Sometimes she'd talk to Walter, her voice low and wistful. "Can you believe it, darling?" she'd say into the quiet. "Me, a mother again." In those moments, the ache of loss softened just a little, replaced by the warmth of something returned. She didn't need to understand it completely. She just needed to be present for it. There were hard days, of course, nights when Daniel cried for hours and nothing soothed him. Days when her back ached and the bags under her eyes grew darker than usual. But even then, there was no part of her that doubted she was doing the right thing. She was learning all over again: how to pack a diaper bag, how to sanitize bottles, how to interpret every gurgle and squirm. Valerie continued her visits, though they grew less frequent as time went on. One afternoon, after watching Helen spoon applesauce into Daniel's eager mouth, Valerie had leaned back and said, almost to herself, "This house feels like his home." Helen hadn't replied. She didn't need to. The town began to adjust to the new normal. The local librarian, Mrs. Canfield, started setting aside baby books for Helen each week. At church, the congregation welcomed Daniel like he'd always been part of the flock, passing him down the pew like precious cargo during coffee hour. Even the postman, who had once delivered little more than junk mail and the occasional magazine, began slipping toys into Helen's mailbox with a wink. It was as if the entire town, in its quiet, unassuming way, had adopted Daniel right along with her. One afternoon in early spring, Helen brought Daniel to the annual Willow Creek picnic in the park. The air was warm, the sky full of drifting clouds, and children ran in every direction with sticky hands and shoelaces undone. She spread a blanket beneath the shade of a tall oak and watched Daniel reach out to the grass, his fingers tugging gently at the blades with a look of intense concentration. Nearby, an older couple strolled by and paused, smiling at the scene. "He's beautiful," the woman said. "Your grandson?" Helen paused for only a moment. "No," she said with a smile. "He's mine." That night, as she rocked him to sleep, she thought about the life they were building. It wasn't conventional. It wasn't easy. But it was theirs. She'd begun keeping a journal again, something she hadn't done in years. Each night after Daniel was asleep, she'd write to him, filling pages with the little details of their days. The first time he clapped, the way he said, "Ba ba," when he saw his bottle, the way he reached for her even in sleep. "Someday," she wrote in one entry, "you'll ask me where you came from, and I'll tell you the truth. But I'll also tell you how you changed my life from the very first moment I saw you." She didn't know what the future would bring. There were still unanswered questions, shadows from the past that hadn't yet come to light. But she had Daniel, and Daniel had her. That was the beginning and the middle, and for now, all that mattered. Helen had thought her life had slowed, that her story was winding down. But now she knew it had only just begun. The years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book, and Daniel grew from a toddling boy with sticky hands into a bright, inquisitive child who never stopped asking questions. He had Helen's laugh now, everyone said, though no one could quite explain how. His hair was the color of chestnuts in fall, and his eyes held a quiet intelligence that often caught adults off guard. He was 6 when the questions began, not in a loud or demanding way, but in that quiet, thoughtful tone he used when trying to understand the world. It started one night at bedtime, his little voice rising through the darkness as Helen tucked the blanket under his chin. "Grandma," he said softly, "how come I don't have a mommy and daddy like the other kids at school?" Helen paused, the corners of her mouth tightening before she smoothed them into a gentle smile. "Well," she said, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, "families come in all kinds of ways. Some kids have 2 mommies or 2 daddies, some have just one, and some have someone special like me." Daniel nodded slowly, seeming satisfied, but Helen knew it was only the beginning. Children always sense more than they're told, and Daniel was no exception. Over the next year, the questions grew, subtle at first, like gentle knocks on a closed door. "Was I in your belly, Grandma?" he asked one rainy afternoon while they baked cookies. Helen hesitated just a breath before answering, No, sweetheart. You came to me a different way, a special way. Daniel accepted this with a kind of quiet wonder, but a seed had been planted. By the time he turned 8, he began to ask more pointed questions. Why don't I have any baby pictures? Where's my birth certificate? Do I have the same last name as you? Each time Helen would offer just enough to soothe his curiosity, but not enough to open the whole truth. It wasn't because she wanted to lie. It was because the truth, as she knew it, had so many holes, like a story with half its pages missing. She still remembered the day she found him on the porch like it was yesterday, wrapped in that green blanket with a note she'd read 1,000 times. But she had never found out who had left him or why. And that blank space in his story haunted her more than she admitted. One evening, while they were putting together a puzzle of the United States, Daniel placed the last piece into Florida and looked up at her. If I didn't come from you, then where did I come from? His voice was steady, but his eyes were searching, and Helen knew she couldn't keep pushing the answers further away. She set down the puzzle box and took a deep breath. Daniel, she said, taking his hand. In hers, I don't know everything, but I do know this: you were left on my porch with a note asking me to take care of you. And from the very first moment I saw you, I knew that I would. Daniel was quiet, processing, his eyes drifting back to the puzzle. So someone didn't want me? He asked, and her heart cracked like old china. No, no, my love, she whispered, pulling him into her arms. Whoever left you wanted you to be safe. They chose someone who would love you forever. After that conversation, something shifted. Daniel became more thoughtful, more observant. He began looking at old photo albums, comparing his features to Helen's, studying the faces of people in town like he was searching for something familiar. At school, he wrote an essay titled Where I Came From, in which he described arriving in the world like a package delivered to the right address. His teacher called Helen in for a meeting afterward. It's a beautiful essay, she said gently, but it's clear he's looking for something. Helen nodded, her fingers folded tightly in her lap. He's starting to ask the hard questions, she admitted. And I don't know if I have the answers. Valerie returned for a visit around that time, her hair now silver and her steps slower, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. After dinner, as they sipped tea on the porch, Valerie said, He's going to keep digging, you know. You can't protect him from the truth forever. Helen sighed, her gaze fixed on the stars above the fields. I'm not trying to protect him from the truth, she said. I'm trying to protect him from the pain of not having one. As Daniel neared his 12th birthday, he began spending time at the local library after school, supposedly working on homework. But one day Helen found a stack of books in his backpack about adoption, family tracing, and DNA tests. She didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, she quietly began her own search again, reaching out to the county office, speaking to a retired sheriff's deputy who remembered the case of the baby on the porch, but had never turned up a lead. Every path ended in the same dark hallway, but Helen felt it in her bones now. Something was changing. The truth was stirring, just beyond reach. Daniel was looking for where he came from. And even though Helen feared what he might find, she knew, in her heart, that he had every right to search. She also knew without doubt that no matter what they uncovered, her love for him would never change. He was her boy. And maybe, just maybe, it was finally time for the truth to come into the light. The summer Daniel turned 13 brought with it a heat that clung to everything, from the wooden porch swing to the air in Helen's lungs, thick and heavy. She had just returned from pruning the rose bushes in the front yard, her gloved hands dusty and sore when she opened the mailbox and saw it, an envelope unlike any she had received in years. There was no stamp, no return address, just her name written in neat slanted cursive, a kind of writing that looked almost too careful, too deliberate. She felt a strange ripple down her back, as if someone had whispered her name in a dream. Holding the envelope gingerly, she walked up the porch steps, heart ticking faster, and sat down on the swing where she'd once rocked Daniel to sleep as a baby. The envelope was smooth, unmarked except for her name. She turned it over. It wasn't sealed. She slid the letter out slowly, like pulling the truth out of the past. The paper inside was thin, aged at the corners, and carried a faint scent. Lavender, maybe, or something like it. Her eyes scanned the short message written in the same careful hand. I know what you did. He deserves the truth. If you want answers, look in the place where it all began. That was all. No signature, no date, nothing to explain who had written it or how they knew anything. For several moments, Helen didn't breathe. Her fingers trembled as she folded the paper again, pressing it flat with her palm. Her eyes drifted toward the porch steps, the same ones she had opened that unforgettable morning nearly 13 years ago to find a baby wrapped in a green blanket. She sat there long after the sun slipped lower in the sky, thinking. Her thoughts chased each other in circles. Who had written the note, what they knew, what they wanted. But more than anything, she couldn't stop thinking about the phrase, where it all began. It could only mean one place. That very porch, where Daniel's life with her had begun. She stood up slowly, legs stiff, and began to examine the area around the steps, crouching down to run her hand along the railings, underneath the wooden planks. Her fingers brushed against something metallic and cold, taped to the underside of the bottom step. She carefully peeled it loose, a key, small, brass, and slightly tarnished. She stared at it in her palm, her heart thudding like a drum. What did this open? Inside the house, she placed the key on the kitchen table and stared at it under the light. It didn't match any key she owned. Not the house, not the garage, not even the old storage shed. But it stirred a faint memory. She opened the drawer, beneath the phone where she kept old odds and ends. At the very back was a lockbox, one she hadn't opened in years. She fit the key into the lock, half expecting nothing to happen. But with a soft click, it opened. Inside, nestled among yellowed receipts and brittle letters, was a folded paper she didn't remember placing there. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. Written in the same tidy handwriting as the letter, it said, I had no choice. I had to leave him. If you're reading this, thank you. There are things he will need to know. This key opens locker 47 at Willow Creek bus station. Helen's heart jumped. That bus station had been closed for nearly a decade, shuttered when a new one was built downtown. The old building still stood on the edge of town, forgotten and dust-covered, but the lockers might still be there. She looked toward the hallway where Daniel's bedroom door stood closed. She wasn't ready to tell him everything. Not yet, but something inside her whispered that the moment was drawing near. The next morning, she told Daniel they were going on a little errand, just the two of them. He looked up from his cereal, surprised but intrigued. Where? He asked, spoon halfway to his mouth. Somewhere I haven't been in a long time, Helen said with a small smile. It's time we find out more. She didn't say much during the drive. The old bus station sat at the edge of town, half swallowed by creeping ivy and years of disuse. The windows were boarded in places, and the air smelled of dust and old concrete. But as they pushed open the creaky side door, a sense of something sacred hung in the air, like stepping into a forgotten memory. The lockers were still there, their paint chipped and numbers faded, but they stood in rows just as they once had. Helen walked slowly along them, counting until she found it. Number 47. Her hand hesitated over the lock. Daniel stood beside her now, sensing the weight of the moment. What is it? He whispered. Something that might help us understand, she said quietly. She slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft, stubborn click. The door creaked open. Inside was a small leather satchel, old and worn, its strap frayed. She lifted it out, her breath caught in her throat. They didn't speak again until they were back home, seated at the kitchen table. Daniel watched silently as Helen unbuckled the strap and slowly opened the bag. Inside were several items, each carrying a whisper of the past. A faded photograph of a young woman cradling a newborn, a sealed envelope marked, "For Daniel when he's ready," and a birth certificate. Daniel reached for the photograph first. He stared at it for a long time. She looks like me, he said quietly. Helen placed her hand over his. I think that's your birth mother, she said, her voice trembling. Daniel looked at her, eyes wide with questions. But this time she didn't rush to answer them. She knew the truth was finally beginning to emerge, and no matter how painful or complicated it might be, they were going to face it together. The day after they discovered the contents of the satchel, a quiet stillness settled over the house. Daniel hadn't said much. He kept the photograph close, even slipping it beneath his pillow the night before as if afraid it might vanish in the dark. Helen moved through the morning like someone living between two versions of herself, before the key and after. She watched Daniel now sitting on the edge of the porch, the summer sunlight painting golden patches across his shoulders. His posture had changed somehow. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was someone looking for answers. Helen brewed a pot of tea she didn't touch and stood staring at the map drawer in the hallway. She pulled it open and unfolded a county map, tracing the roads with her finger until it stopped on a place just beyond the river bend. An address, the one scribbled on the back of Daniel's birth certificate. It was in a place called Fairgrove, a small town nestled between forest and farmland about an hour's drive away. She'd passed it years ago, but never had reason to stop. Now, it pulled at her like a loose thread that needed tugging. She waited until Daniel came in, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans, his eyes asking what his voice did not. I found the address on the back of the certificate, she said softly. I think we should go there just to see. Daniel didn't answer right away, but his nod came with the kind of quiet courage that lives inside people who have waited a long time to understand themselves. Okay, he said. Let's go. They packed lightly, just water bottles, snacks, a flashlight in case, and the photograph. Helen folded the birth certificate and placed it in her purse. As they backed out of the driveway, the house seemed to watch them go, the porch swing swaying slightly in the breeze like it too remembered the day Daniel first arrived. The drive was long and winding, the road narrowing as they left the familiarity of their small town behind. Trees grew denser, fields stretched wide and quiet, and the hum of the tires on pavement was the only sound between them for miles. Fairgrove was smaller than Helen remembered. Just a handful of buildings, an old diner, a post office, a single gas pump that looked older than Helen herself. They stopped in front of a white house with peeling shutters and a rusted mailbox that leaned to one side. The number matched the one on the birth certificate. Helen sat still for a moment, hands tight around the wheel. Are you ready? She asked. Daniel stared at the house. I think so, he said, but I'm not sure what we'll find. They walked up the path together. The house had the feel of something half asleep, like a story paused mid-sentence. Helen knocked once. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. The door opened a crack. A woman in her 60s peeked through, her face sharp with suspicion. Can I help you? She asked. Helen cleared her throat. We're looking for someone who used to live here, she said. Her name might be Emily or Emmeline. We found an old document with this address. The woman frowned and opened the door wider. That was my sister's house, she said. She passed away 5 years ago. Helen felt her breath hitch. Daniel stood silently beside her, his face unreadable. Did she have a child? Helen asked gently. The woman's eyes narrowed. Why are you asking? Helen hesitated, then opened her purse and pulled out the photo. She handed it over. The woman took one look and gasped softly. That's Emily, she whispered. And that baby. Oh my God. She pressed the photo to her chest for a moment. Come in, she said. The house smelled of dust and lavender soap. Photographs lined the mantel, family, holidays, birthdays long past. The woman introduced herself as Ruth. She poured tea, hands shaking slightly, and sat across from them, with the photograph in her lap. Emily was young when she got pregnant, she said. Barely out of high school. Our parents didn't take it well. She wanted to keep the baby, but things got hard. Really hard. Ruth looked at Daniel then, her eyes softening. She never told us what happened to him. One day he was just gone. She never recovered from it. Daniel looked down at the floor. Helen reached over and touched his hand. "Do you know who the father was?" she asked quietly. Ruth shook her head. Emily never told anyone, but she always blamed herself for what happened. She thought she'd failed her son. She left a few things in a box, kept it locked up in the attic. I never looked inside. Ruth led them up a narrow staircase, the air thick with time. The attic door creaked open, and dust danced in the golden light. In the corner sat a small trunk. Ruth opened it with a key she kept on a chain around her neck. Inside were letters, drawings, a pair of baby socks, and a journal. Helen lifted the journal carefully and handed it to Daniel. He sat down on the floor and began to read. Page after page of a young woman's handwriting filled the space with aching love, regret, and hope. If you're reading this, I hope you found someone who's given you love. I hope you're not angry. I did what I thought was best. I loved you more than anything, and I always will. Tears streamed silently down Daniel's face. Helen knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around him. Ruth stood quietly by the doorway, wiping at her eyes. In that quiet, dusty attic, the years of wondering, aching, and not knowing began to lift like dust in sunlight. They hadn't found all the answers, but they had found something real, a connection, a name, and a mother's truth. The ride home from Fairgrove was a quiet one. The journal sat in Daniel's lap, hugged close to his chest like a relic of someone he had known only in shadows. Helen glanced over at him now and then, seeing the way he stared out the window, not lost exactly, but somewhere far away in thought. The truth had changed something in him. The lines of his face seemed a little firmer, his eyes a little older. The past had finally reached him, and instead of crumbling under it, he seemed to absorb it, carrying it like a part of himself. They didn't talk much that night. Helen made dinner, though neither of them ate more than a few bites. Daniel retreated to his room, journal in hand, while Helen stayed up staring at the photo they had brought home, the young woman holding the infant with a love so pure it seemed to radiate off the worn edges of the paper. Emily. That name now meant something, more than a line on a document. She was real now, not just in memory but in story and voice in written pages. The next morning, Helen found Daniel at the kitchen table, the journal open in front of him, a cup of untouched coffee by his side. His eyes were puffy, but clear. "There's more," he said quietly. "She talks about someone named Ben. She never says his full name, but she loved him, and he left." Helen sat beside him and listened as Daniel read aloud. "Ben said we'd run away together. He promised we'd start over in another town, just the three of us. But when I showed him the sonogram, he went quiet. He came back the next day with tears in his eyes and told me it would never work, that his family would never forgive him. I begged him to stay, but he walked away. I never saw him again." Helen's stomach twisted. The lines on the page echoed with pain, the kind that etched itself into someone's bones. "She never wrote his last name?" Helen asked. Daniel shook his head. "Only Ben. But look." He flipped a few pages forward. "Sometimes I wonder if Ben ever looked for you. If he thought of the baby we made. I hope he did. I hope he's alive and well, and I hope he forgave himself." They sat in silence a while, the ticking of the clock the only sound in the room. Then Daniel closed the journal carefully. "I want to find him," he said. "I want to know if he ever thought about her, about me." Helen hesitated. Tracking down someone from over a decade ago with only a first name would be nearly impossible. But then she remembered something. Ruth had mentioned that Emily once worked at a coffee shop downtown for a short while. She had told Helen in passing, between sips of tea and tears. "What if we asked Ruth if she remembers where Emily worked?" Helen suggested. Daniel nodded. Later that day, they called Ruth. She picked up quickly, and after a moment of quiet, thinking, said, "It was called Corner Cup, on Maple Street. It's not there anymore, but maybe someone who worked there still is." Helen thanked her and hung up. They drove into town and parked in front of a hardware store where the coffee shop used to be. Helen walked inside while Daniel waited, feeling the weight of anticipation sitting like a stone in his chest. The bell above the door jingled. A man behind the counter looked up and gave Helen a nod. "Sorry to bother you," Helen said politely. "I'm looking for someone who used to work in this building back when it was a coffee shop. Do you remember Corner Cup?" The man chuckled. "Sure do. I used to get my morning latte there every day. Shame it closed. Do you remember a girl named Emily? Worked there about 15 years ago." The man's brows rose. "Yeah, Emily Palmer, I think. Sweet girl. Real quiet. Dated a guy who used to work part-time across the street. Ben something." Helen's heart jumped. "Do you remember his last name?" He squinted. "Ben Hastings, maybe. Lived out near the Lake Road. Haven't seen him in years, but his folks still run the bait shop out there." Helen thanked him, heart racing, and returned to the car. When she told Daniel what she'd learned, his breath caught. "That has to be him," he whispered. "That has to be my father." They drove to the edge of town where the lake curved gently beneath the sky, and the bait shop sat quiet and sun-bleached beside the water. An older couple stood behind the counter, arranging fishing supplies. Helen approached slowly. "We're looking for Ben Hastings," she said. "We were told he used to work downtown. We think he might have known someone named Emily Palmer." The woman's eyes widened slightly, and the man turned to face them fully. "Ben's our son," the woman said carefully. "He doesn't live around here anymore, but we can give you his number. Is this about Emily?" Daniel stepped forward then, his voice steady but quiet. "She was my mother," he said. "And I think Ben might be my father." The woman's hand went to her mouth. The man lowered his head. "We always wondered," he said softly. "Ben was never the same after she left. He said he'd made a mistake he could never fix." They gave Daniel the number. He stared at it for a long time before folding it into his pocket. He didn't call right away, not because he was scared, but because he wanted to be ready. That night, he sat on the porch with Helen as the stars blinked into place overhead. "I feel like the world just got bigger," he said, "but not scarier, just fuller." Helen smiled and wrapped her arm around him. "That's what the truth does," she said. "It makes room for everything that was missing." And as the night settled around them, Daniel held his mother's journal close and looked out into the dark, knowing that whatever came next, he wasn't walking into it alone. 2 days passed before Daniel made the call. He carried the small slip of paper with Ben Hastings' number in his back pocket like a fragile artifact, folding and unfolding it until the creases were soft and worn. Helen didn't pressure him. She knew the weight of that moment had to rest in his hands alone. Still, she was near if he needed her. Always had been. Always would be. On the morning of the third day, Daniel rose early. The sun hadn't yet pushed over the hills, and the house was still wrapped in that silvery hush that comes just before dawn. He stood at the kitchen counter, holding his phone, staring down at the number one last time before punching it in. Each ring felt like a hammer strike on an old wall. Then a voice answered. Older, cautious but not unkind. "Hello?" Daniel cleared his throat. "Hi. This might sound strange, but I think I might be your son." There was a silence. Not the kind that comes when someone hangs up. The kind that stretches, heavy and stunned, because something unexpected just cracked open. The man on the line didn't respond right away. Then slowly, "Who is this?" "My name is Daniel," he said more firmly now. "My mother's name was Emily Palmer. She left me on a doorstep when I was a baby. We found a journal. She wrote about someone named Ben. Someone who said he'd start a life with her but left before I was born." The silence again. And then, a sound like the slow, uneven exhale of someone who'd been holding their breath for 18 years. "I think you'd better come meet me," the man said quietly. They arranged a time. That same afternoon, Helen and Daniel got in the car and drove out past the next town. into a small rural area where the land opened up into wide stretches of green and time moved just a little slower. Ben lived in a modest house at the edge of a wooded hill. A truck sat in the gravel driveway and a golden retriever ambled out to greet them as they pulled in. Ben was already waiting at the door. He looked older than Helen expected, lines deep around his eyes, hair mostly gray, but he carried himself with the solid weight of someone who'd worked with his hands all his life. He wore a flannel shirt and worn jeans, and when he stepped forward, Helen saw the echo of Daniel in his posture. She saw the same eyes, same nose. No test in the world would be more convincing than the sight of the two of them standing just a few feet apart. "You look like her," Ben said, voice thick. "Even more than I remember." Daniel didn't know what to say. He just nodded. "Come on in," Ben said after a moment. "Let's talk." Inside, the house was simple. Bookshelves lined one wall. A fire crackled in the stone hearth even though it was a warm day, and photographs filled the mantel. None of Emily, of course, just Ben and what looked like his parents. Fishing trips, birthdays, years that passed without knowing. He led them to a table near the window and sat across from Daniel. Then he pulled out an old weathered photo from his wallet and placed it gently on the table. It was the same picture they had found in Emily's journal, only this copy was faded, cracked at the corners, as if it had been touched too often. "I've kept this all these years," Ben said. "Not a day goes by I don't think about her, or about the child I walked away from." Helen watched Daniel carefully, but he seemed composed, like he'd braced himself for this. "Why did you leave?" Daniel asked quietly. Ben sighed. "Because I was a coward. I was 20, scared, and didn't have the backbone to stand up to my family. They said it would ruin my future, that I'd throw everything away for a girl they thought I barely knew. But I loved her. I did. When I saw that sonogram, something in me cracked. I couldn't believe I was going to be a father. And instead of rising to the moment, I ran from it." He looked directly at Daniel then, eyes rimmed with tears. "I thought of you every year on your birthday. I didn't even know your name. I wanted to look, but I didn't know where to begin. When Emily passed, I went to the funeral, stayed in the back, never spoke. I didn't feel like I had the right. I figured you'd been adopted. I told myself it was better that way." Daniel sat still, absorbing it all. "She left me on a doorstep," he said. "I always wondered why, but now I think she was trying to give me a better chance, and she did. Helen raised me. She's my mom, but I still wanted to know where I came from." Ben looked at Helen then. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for raising him, for being there when I wasn't." Helen nodded, emotion thick in her chest. "He saved me too," she said. "That day he showed up on my porch was the day everything changed. I didn't know how much I needed him until he was already mine." Ben's eyes glistened. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said to Daniel. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to know you, however much you'll allow." Daniel looked down at the photograph on the table. His mother's arms wrapped around him as an infant, her eyes filled with a love that never had a chance to bloom. He imagined what she'd say now, seeing the man who had once promised to be there, and then vanished. He imagined she'd want him to listen, to try. "I'm not ready to call you Dad," Daniel said honestly, "but I think I'd like to start with Ben, and we'll see where it goes." Ben nodded, swallowing hard. "That's more than I deserve, thank you." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about the past, about small things, baseball, old movies, favorite foods. It wasn't much, but it was something. A beginning, carved from the broken edges of years lost, and sometimes that was more than enough. The summer storm came unexpectedly. It had started as a warm breeze sweeping across the fields behind Helen's house. But by afternoon, thunder rolled low across the sky and the clouds gathered like dark wool above the trees. Helen and Daniel had just returned home from another visit with Ben. The three of them had met again, this time at a small diner halfway between their towns, and talked over cherry pie and endless coffee refills. There was still a sense of carefulness between Daniel and Ben like two men trying to learn a language neither had ever spoken aloud, but the conversation was easier now. Less like excavation, more like discovery. When the storm broke that evening, the rain came down in heavy sheets, drumming against the windows and roof with rhythmic urgency. Daniel stood by the kitchen window, watching lightning flash over the fields. He had been quiet all afternoon, more thoughtful than usual. Helen knew that look well. It meant something was stirring beneath the surface. He asked if I wanted to meet his parents again. Daniel said suddenly, not turning from the window. I saw them when we went to the bait shop, but just for a minute. Now Ben wants to bring me to a family dinner. Helen paused, drying her hands on a towel. And what did you say? I told him I'd think about it, Daniel replied. He says they've wanted to know me for years, that they thought about reaching out but figured I had a new life, that maybe I wouldn't want anything to do with them. Helen approached slowly, placing a hand on his shoulder. And how do you feel about it? Daniel shrugged, but she could feel the tension in his posture. Part of me's curious. Another part feels like I'm intruding, like I'm stepping into something that should have been there from the start but wasn't. What if they don't like me? What if I don't like them? Helen gave a small smile. Family's messy, Daniel. The ones we're born into and the ones we find. But it's not about being perfect, it's about showing up. If they care enough to want to meet you now, that's something. And if you care enough to go, that's something too. The next evening, Ben picked him up. The rain had cleared, but the ground was still wet and the sky hung low with the remnants of the storm. Helen watched from the porch as the truck pulled away, Daniel's silhouette framed in the passenger seat, shoulders squared, jaw set. He looked like a young man walking into something he couldn't name yet, but ready to face it anyway. Ben's parents lived in a farmhouse not far from the lake, surrounded by tall grass and a white picket fence that had seen better days. The lights glowed warmly from the windows and the scent of roasted chicken and biscuits drifted out when the door opened. His grandmother, Margaret, met him with a hug so sudden and tight it startled him. You look just like your mother, she said with a voice soft as worn cotton. We never stopped thinking about you, you know, not for 1 second. Daniel, unsure of what to say, simply nodded. His grandfather, Walt, shook his hand firmly, then clapped him on the back. You've got a good grip, he said. That's a Hastings handshake. They sat down for dinner and the conversation started slow. But it wasn't long before the questions came, gentle at first. What had he studied in school? What kind of music did he like? Did he play sports? Daniel answered each one carefully, sometimes laughing, sometimes pausing before he spoke. They listened, not just politely but fully, with a kind of attentiveness that told him they were savoring the chance to learn who he was. After dinner, Margaret brought out a photo album. It was filled with pictures of Ben as a boy, fishing, riding bikes, grinning with missing teeth. There were baby pictures, high school graduation, and tucked near the back, a photo Daniel hadn't seen before. It was of Emily, standing beside Ben, her hand on her belly, smiling shyly at the camera. Daniel stared at it, heart thudding. She sent us this once, Margaret said softly. Ben showed us the letter. She said she hoped we'd remember her, not with blame but with kindness. She never said where she went after, just that she wanted to give you a better life. Daniel touched the edge of the photograph, tracing the faces of the two people who had brought him into the world. He felt a strange ache, one part longing, one part gratitude. Before he left that night, Walt handed him a small wooden box. Ben carved this when he thought you were coming, he said. It's yours now. Inside was a whittled toy boat, small and simple, smooth with age. It was imperfect, clearly made by a young man still learning to shape things with his hands. But it was real, tangible, like a memory that had finally found its way home. Driving back, Daniel was quiet again. But this silence felt different, less heavy, more like the silence of someone still taking it all in. When they pulled into Helen's driveway, he turned to Ben and said, Thanks for today. for not giving up. Ben looked at him, eyes misting. Thank you for giving me the chance. Back inside, Helen was waiting with a warm blanket and tea. Daniel sank into the couch beside her, the wooden box in his lap. It went better than I expected, he said. They didn't treat me like a stranger. They treated me like I belonged. Helen brushed his hair back gently, smiling. That's because you do. Outside, the storm had passed completely. The air was clean, the stars were out, and the world, for the first time in a long time, felt like it was finally beginning to make sense. The morning after the dinner with Ben's family, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his fingers tracing the edges of the small wooden box Walt had given him. The whittled boat inside now rested on a windowsill, catching the early sunlight. Helen was preparing breakfast behind him, humming softly as she stirred a pot of oatmeal the way she had every morning since he was little. But today Daniel's thoughts were not in the present. They were with his mother, Emily, the woman who had left behind only fragments of herself. Half a journal, a faded photograph, and now a story filled with missing pages. Helen, Hila, said quietly, do you think she ever tried to reach me? I mean, maybe she wrote something more. Letters she didn't send, things she wanted me to know but couldn't say at the time. Helen turned. The wooden spoon paused in her hand. I don't know, sweetheart, but if she did, they'd probably be with her things. And you still have that box in the attic. We never looked through all of it. They both went up after breakfast, the old stairs creaking beneath their feet, the attic door groaning softly as Helen pushed it open. Sunlight streamed through the narrow window, catching dust motes in the air. In the far corner sat the weathered trunk that had come with Emily's few belongings, mostly baby clothes, a blanket, and the journal that had started all of this. They opened it slowly. Daniel knelt and began lifting things out gently as though handling pieces of a fragile world. Beneath a layer of old books and worn fabric, he found an envelope tucked between the folds of a flannel shirt. His hand stilled. There was no name on the front, just the word, someday. Daniel looked up at Helen, who nodded silently. He opened it. Inside were 6 letters, each carefully written in Emily's delicate handwriting. Some were tear-stained. One had a small drawing of a baby's hand curled around a mother's finger. Each letter was addressed to a moment in his life. Your first day of school, when you fall in love, when you feel lost, when you want to know me, and when you become a father. The 6th had no title. Just a date, 2 weeks before she passed. He didn't read them all at once. He couldn't. He held them against his chest for a long while before setting them gently aside. Then he opened the one marked, "When you want to know me." My sweet boy, it began. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if life will give me the grace of being part of your story, but I want you to know the truth, as best as I can tell it. As Daniel read, his throat tightened. She wrote of being 17, terrified but in love, of how Ben had held her hand the night she showed him the sonogram, of how his family had pushed him away, not out of cruelty, but fear, of how she had waited and hoped and finally decided to leave for his sake. She told him about the night she left him on the doorstep, wrapped in the blanket now faded with time, whispering to him that he was loved more than he could ever understand. I chose her because she seemed kind, Emily had written. Because I saw her watering the flowers every morning, and once I saw her bring soup to the neighbor's doorstep without a word. I knew she'd love you. I just hoped you'd one day forgive me. Daniel's tears came freely as he read, falling silently onto the pages. Helen sat nearby, her own eyes glassy, watching the boy she raised piece together the parts of a mother's love that had been hidden in shadow for so long. Later that day, Daniel took a walk down to the small creek behind the house. It was the Yao, same place where he'd played as a boy, throwing stones, chasing frogs. He sat on a mossy log and took out the last letter, the one dated 2 weeks before her death. Daniel, it read, I hope the world has been kind to you. I hope you have found love and laughter and purpose. If not, I hope you keep going until you do. There are things I regret. Not because I didn't love you, but because I didn't know how to fight for us. But you were never a mistake. You were the truest thing I ever made. If you ever find your father and if he wants to know you, let him. Don't carry my pain as your own. Carry only love. I will always be with you, and I will always be proud of you. He folded the letter with trembling fingers and sat quietly for a long time, letting the words settle deep into his bones. The wind moved gently through the trees, as if carrying her voice with it. For the first time, Daniel didn't feel like a boy abandoned. He felt like a man who had been deeply loved in silence. That evening, he brought the letters down and placed them in a small wooden frame, each folded and preserved behind glass, like sacred heirlooms. Helen helped him hang them in his room, just above the desk where he now sometimes wrote. It felt like putting a heartbeat on the wall. He called Ben that night. She wrote to me, Daniel said. Letters she never sent. She never stopped loving either of us. She just didn't know how to hold on. Ben was quiet on the other end. Then, I'd like to read them someday, if you'd let me. I think she'd want that, Daniel replied. The past, it seemed, didn't always need to be buried. Sometimes it just needed to be found, dusted off, and held up to the light. The early autumn wind rustled the leaves across the quiet front yard, their edges tinged in gold and red. Helen sat on the porch in her old wooden rocking chair, a warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching as Daniel came up the road with Ben beside him. Something about the way the two walked, not too fast, not too slow, in comfortable silence, reminded her of years long past, when Daniel had first learned to ride his bike, when she'd stood at this very porch praying he wouldn't fall, and, somehow knowing even if he did, he'd rise again. Daniel and Ben had just returned from visiting the grave of Emily Hastings. It wasn't a grand headstone, simple gray marble, her name etched with quiet dignity, surrounded by small wildflowers planted by the groundskeeper each spring. It had taken Daniel weeks to gather the courage to go, and when he finally did, he asked Ben to come. Not just because Emily had loved them both, but because somehow the silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It had become a space they could share. At the cemetery, Daniel knelt beside the stone and placed a folded letter at its base. One he'd written himself. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't need to. What mattered was that he'd found the words, that he'd chosen to speak, even if only to the wind and the trees. I told her thank you, Daniel said as they reached the porch. For letting you find me, for trusting Helen, and for being brave enough to do what she did, even if it broke her heart. Ben nodded, his eyes still red. I left something too. A photo of the three of us. That one from the lake. A few weeks ago. I told her it finally happened, that we found our way back. Helen smiled gently and motioned for them to sit. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the hills, casting a golden hue over everything. It was the kind of evening that made time feel suspended, like the world was holding its breath in reverence. I always wondered, Daniel said, looking out over the yard, what it would feel like to know where I came from. I thought it would be like flipping a switch, like suddenly I'd understand everything, but it's not like that at all. Helen glanced over at him. Then what's it like, sweetheart? He thought for a long moment before answering. It's like reading the last chapter of a book you didn't know you were already in. It doesn't explain everything, but it changes how you see the beginning. Ben leaned back in the porch chair beside him. And does it feel finished now? The story? Daniel looked down at his hands, the creases of his palms, the small scar on his finger, from a childhood bike fall. Then he smiled faintly. Not finished, just understood. That evening they cooked dinner together. Helen made her famous pot roast, and the kitchen filled with the smell of onions, rosemary, and comfort. Ben set the table, and Daniel, who had never much liked cooking, chopped carrots while Helen teased him for using the knife like he was defusing a bomb. They laughed more than they had in weeks. Laughed like people who had lived through storms and come out soaked but whole. And when dinner was served, they each raised a glass, of water, wine, or sweet tea, and Helen offered a quiet toast. To second chances, she said, her voice soft but sure. And to the people who give them. The clink of glasses was quiet but meaningful. After dinner, Helen brought out an old photo album that hadn't been touched in years. They flipped through pictures of Daniel as a child. Missing teeth, muddy shoes, Halloween costumes. Ben leaned in, smiling at each one like discovering a secret only he had the key to. "I missed all of this," he said, a hint of grief still, placed in his words. "But you're here now," Helen reminded him, touching his hand. "And he knows you. That's what matters." Daniel closed the album and looked at both of them, eyes clearer than they'd ever been. "I think I'm ready to find out what's next. I've been living in the past so long, trying to piece it together. But I want to see where this story goes." "Have you thought about school again?" Helen asked. "I have," Daniel nodded. "Maybe social work, or youth counseling. Something where I can be the person I needed when I was younger." Ben beamed. "You'd be good at that. You already are." The clock on the mantel chimed 9. Outside, the crickets had begun their evening song. Daniel stood and stretched, the day's emotions settling in his bones. "I'm gonna head up," he said. "Thanks, both of you, for today." Helen rose and hugged him, not with the tightness of a mother afraid to lose, but with the softness of a mother who knew she never truly would. "Good night, baby." Ben gave him a pat on the back, the gesture firm, familiar. "See you in the morning." When Daniel's door closed upstairs, Ben turned to Helen. "You gave him a life. You gave him the best parts of himself." Helen shook her head gently. "He was always those things. I just got to watch them grow." Outside, the leaves rustled again, whispering secrets to the wind. In a house once filled with unanswered questions, there now lived a kind of quiet joy. The truth had come full circle, not to end anything, but to begin everything anew. The days began to grow shorter as autumn settled into its stride, the skies taking on that soft amber hue that made the whole town feel wrapped in an old quilt. Helen's little house, once a sanctuary of unanswered questions and quiet longing, now pulsed with a new rhythm, one built on shared meals, honest conversations, and the growing bond between Daniel and Ben. There were still moments of silence, but now, those silences felt full rather than empty, like the pauses between the notes of a well-loved song. Daniel was changing. He walked taller, smiled more, and carried an ease about him that Helen hadn't seen in years. Some afternoons, he and Ben would take long drives through the countryside. No destination in mind, just the comfort of open roads and open hearts. Other days, they sat out on the porch with coffee, trading stories that built a bridge over years. They could never reclaim, but could now at least understand. One Saturday morning, as a crisp breeze swept through the trees, Daniel brought something down from the attic. An old cardboard box, sealed with tape yellowed by time. He set it on the living room floor and Helen raised an eyebrow. "I found it tucked behind the beams. I think it's yours," he said with a grin. Helen knelt beside the box, brushing dust from the top before peeling it open. Inside were photo albums, newspaper clippings, and a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out a photograph. Her younger self holding baby Daniel, her face both terrified and fiercely protective. "I forgot I still had these," she whispered. Daniel leaned over her shoulder. "That's the backyard, isn't it?" Helen nodded, smiling faintly. "You used to scream like the world was ending if I tried to put you down. I carried you everywhere. I think I developed permanent back problems before you were 6 months old." Daniel chuckled, the sound warm and true. "Sorry about that." They spent hours going through the box. Ben joined them midway, drawn by the smell of coffee and the sound of laughter. There were pictures of Christmas mornings, school field days, even one of Helen standing in front of her flower garden, arms covered in dirt, grinning like a child. Earring. The bottom of the box was a worn composition notebook, its pages yellowed and edges frayed. Helen opened it, her breath catching. "My journal," she murmured. She turned to the first page. Dated the week after Daniel arrived. "I don't know if I'm doing this right. He cries a lot. I cry too sometimes. But when he sleeps, he curls up like he's still in the womb, like he knows he's safe. And I hope, I can be enough for him. Tears welled in her eyes. But they were not sad tears. They were full of all the years, all the fears, all the love that had never stopped growing. She passed the journal to Daniel. "You should read it," she said. "It's part of your story, too." Daniel took it gently, his fingers tracing the edge of the cover. "I will. Thank you for keeping it." Later that evening, after Ben had gone home and Helen was in bed, Daniel sat by the fireplace reading her words. Each entry painted a picture of his early life. First words, scraped knees. Nights when he was sick and Helen stayed up singing lullabies off-key. There were entries about doubt, about loneliness, about the weight of raising a child alone. But overwhelmingly there was love. Fierce, steady, unwavering love. One entry stood out more than the rest. He asked me today if he had a real mom. I told him yes, and that she loved him very much. He didn't ask why she left, just nodded like that. Answer was enough. I hope one day he'll understand both of us. I hope he knows that being his mother in every way that counts has been the greatest gift of my life. Daniel closed the notebook and leaned back in the chair, the warmth of the fire washing over him. For so long he'd chased answers, thinking that the truth would either fix something or break it. But now he realized the truth had simply filled in the blanks of a love that had always been there. It didn't erase the pain, but it honored it, and it gave him peace. The next morning he knocked on Helen's bedroom door before sunrise. She opened it groggily, rubbing her eyes. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He nodded. "I just wanted to tell you something." She stepped into the hallway, pulling her robe tighter around her. "What is it?" "I know who my mother was now," he said softly. "But I also know who raised me, who stayed, who taught me right from wrong, who held my hand when I was scared, and who loved me even when I didn't understand it. And I just wanted to say, thank you. For all of it." Helen's eyes filled again, and without a word she pulled him into a hug, holding him like she had so many times before. He was no longer the tiny baby left on a doorstep, nor the uncertain teen grappling with questions too big for his heart. He was a young man now, standing firmly in a truth that stretched behind him like a long shadow, but no longer loomed. That afternoon, they invited Ben back for Sunday dinner. They laughed, told stories, and toasted to new beginnings. The heart, it seemed, never truly forgot. It remembered everything, the pain, the joy, the quiet resilience. And in that remembering, it made room for healing. Daniel looked around the table at Helen with her silver hair shining in the light, and at Ben with his eyes full of pride and quiet sorrow, and he realized something simple, something true. He hadn't found his family 18 years ago when he was left on a porch. He'd built it. One choice, one truth, one moment of courage at a time. And somehow, along the way, love had stitched it all together. The first real snow came earlier than expected that year, blanketing the little town in white and turning every rooftop, tree branch, and winding road into something out of a Christmas card. Helen stood by the kitchen window that morning, coffee in hand, watching fat flakes drift lazily down. It reminded her of the day she'd first found Daniel, cold and silent, the world suspended in hush. But now, the same kind of morning brought her a different kind of stillness. The peaceful kind, the kind that made you breathe deep and give thanks. Down the hallway she could hear Daniel moving around, opening drawers, closing closet doors, and humming, to himself. He had always hummed when he was thinking, even as a child. Today he had reason to. This was the day he was moving into his new apartment. It wasn't far, just a 20-minute drive across town, but it marked something important, a step forward. His place was modest. One bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a couch. He had picked out secondhand. But it was his, and that mattered. It meant he was ready. Not just to live on his own, but to live fully, carrying everything he had learned, everything he had uncovered, into a future he was now choosing for himself. Helen didn't cry when he told her he wanted to go. She smiled, hugged him tight, and said, "About time, young man." But in her heart, she had felt a twist, not of pain, but of the kind of ache that only comes from deep love, the kind that knows when it's time to let go. Daniel came into the kitchen, 2 duffel bags slung over his shoulders, his face lit up with both excitement and nervousness. "You ready?" Helen asked, setting her mug down. He nodded. "Mostly. I still can't figure out how to fold that comforter, though." Helen chuckled. "No one can, sweetheart. That's why they invented storage bins." As they loaded the car, Ben pulled into the driveway, his truck packed with boxes from the garage. He'd offered to help Daniel move and spent the last few weekends helping him patch up the new place, fixing a leaky faucet, installing new blinds, replacing the broken doorknob in the bathroom. It was the kind of help a father gives without fanfare, the kind that says, "I'm here," without needing the words. The drive was quiet, save for the occasional directions from Daniel and the soft hum of the radio. When they reached the apartment complex, Daniel hopped out, full of energy, bounding up the stairs 2 at a time like a child on Christmas morning. Helen followed more slowly, taking in the beige walls, the trimmed hedges out front, the little welcome mat Daniel had picked out at the thrift store. Inside, the apartment still smelled like fresh paint and possibility. The sun poured through the windows, warming the worn floorboards and glinting off the small pile of dishes already waiting in the sink. Ben set down a box labeled kitchen stuff and looked around. "It's a good space," he said. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, feels like a fresh start." Helen walked slowly through each room, touching the walls like she was memorizing the place. She stood in the living room for a long moment before turning to face Daniel. "You've made a home, honey. And that's no small thing." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his eyes. "I had good examples." After the furniture was in and the boxes were stacked, they sat on the couch eating sandwiches out of a paper bag and sipping root beer from glass bottles. The snow still drifted outside, coating the balcony in a layer of white. There were no speeches, no big declarations, just the warmth of presence, the comfort of knowing they didn't have to say everything to feel everything. Eventually, Ben stood, brushing crumbs off his jeans. "I should head out, let you settle in." Daniel rose too, clapping his father on the back. "Thanks for everything, Dad." The word hung there for a second, soft and sacred. Ben didn't flinch or falter. He nodded, eyes a little glassy, and said, "Anytime, son." Helen hugged Daniel last. She held on longer than she meant to, then kissed his cheek and whispered, "You'll always have a home with me, no matter where life takes you." "I know," Daniel said, "but I think I'm ready to see where it does." That night, Helen sat back on her porch, wrapped in a thick shawl, sipping tea. The snow had stopped and the stars were starting to prick through the sky like tiny lanterns. She thought of the journey, 18 years of questions and love, of doubt and courage, of holding on and letting go. She thought of the baby on her doorstep and the man he had become, and she felt nothing but gratitude. In his new apartment, Daniel unpacked the last of his boxes, placing the journal Helen had given him on the nightstand. He sat on the bed, stared out at the moonlit street, and let his heart swell with all that had come before. He didn't know exactly what came next, but he knew this. He wasn't lost anymore. He had roots now. And from those roots, he could grow. He picked up his phone and texted Helen one simple line, "Love you, Mom." And miles away, in a quiet house filled with memories and hope, Helen read the message and smiled through tears. Because she knew, as surely as the stars would rise again, tomorrow, that a new chapter had begun. Winter melted slowly that year, as if reluctant to leave behind the quiet hush it had cast over everything. Spring came in a gentle, almost shy way, buds peeking from branches, birds returning with cautious song, the earth slowly stretching after its long sleep. Helen's garden, dormant for months, began to stir again. Tiny green shoots broke through the soil, just as they had every year, a reminder that no matter what, life continued, always leaning toward the light. Daniel visited her every Sunday, just like he used to, but now he arrived in his own car, with stories about work, the small victories of living alone, and the mishaps that came with learning how to cook anything beyond pasta. He had enrolled in a community college program for counseling. Inspired, he said, by how much it had meant to him to finally speak, to finally be heard. Helen listened as he spoke of psychology classes and volunteering at a youth center downtown, her heart both proud and aching in the best way. One afternoon in late April, Daniel came by earlier than usual. He brought Helen her favorite pastries, from the corner bakery, and a little potted lavender plant for her windowsill. "There's something I want to do," he said once they'd sat down, "but I want you there when I do it." Helen set down her teacup. "What is it, sweetheart?" Daniel reached into his bag and pulled out an old envelope, the same one he'd shown her the night he'd first revealed he knew about his birth. The letter, still folded neatly, was worn at the creases, but still intact. He held it with a kind of reverence. "I want to read it again," he said, "out loud with you." Helen nodded slowly. "Then let's do it." They walked together to the porch where the breeze was soft and warm, carrying the smell of earth and blooming things. Daniel sat beside her, took a deep breath, and unfolded the letter. His voice was steady this time, not trembling as it had, once done, not choked with fear or longing, just calm, clear, ready. "To the woman who finds this child," he began, his eyes moving over the words not with pain, but with understanding. "Please know that this decision was not made out of carelessness or cruelty, but out of desperation. I am unable to provide for him to keep him safe. He deserves more than what I can give." Helen closed her eyes, remembering the first time she'd read those words, the way her heart had clenched, not knowing what kind of story the baby in her arms carried. "His name is Daniel. He was born with love, even if he must now be raised without me. I pray that whoever you are, you will care for him as if he were your own." Daniel paused and looked up at Helen, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He continued, "Tell him if you ever can that I loved him, that I hoped he would find joy, that even though I disappeared from his life, he never left my heart." The letter ended there, no signature, no contact, no answers, just words written, in haste or perhaps in sorrow, or maybe both. But now those words felt different, not like a wound but like a bridge, a message that had traveled through time and pain and silence to finally settle where it was meant to all along. Daniel folded the letter slowly, holding it in his hands like something sacred. "I used to think this letter was everything," he said softly, "that it held the key to who I was, but now I realize it's just the beginning of the story, not the whole of it." Helen reached out and gently touched his arm. "That letter may have brought you here, but love raised you." They sat there in silence for a while, the breeze brushing their faces, the sun warming the wooden boards beneath their feet. And then Daniel turned to her. "I want to keep it," he said, "but not because I need it anymore, just as a reminder of where I started and how far I've come." Helen smiled. "That's exactly how I feel every time I look at you." A few weeks later on Mother's Day, Daniel surprised Helen with a framed photo, one of them taken recently, laughing in the garden, dirt smudged on their hands and cheeks. Below it, in elegant script, he had written a single line: "Family isn't who you're born to, it's who you grow with." Helen hung it in the hallway where she could see it every time she passed, and sometimes, when the house was quiet and the sunlight hit the frame just right, she'd pause and look at it, letting the joy settle deep in her bones. Daniel kept the letter in a small box on his nightstand, tucked beside his journal, and a note from Helen she'd once left him when he was 10 and scared to go to school. It read, "You're braver than you think, and I'll always be here when you come home." And so the story came full circle, not with a dramatic twist, but with something quieter, deeper. Healing, growth, a life built with intention and love. The boy left on a doorstep had become a man. who knew who he was. Not because of a letter, not because of a missing past, but because someone had chosen him, chosen to love him, raise him, and give him roots strong enough to carry him wherever he chose to go. And that, in the end, was the truth he had waited all his life to see. And so, from a quiet doorstep to a heart full of love, Daniel's story reminds us that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who choose to love you and never stop showing up. Thank you so much for listening and spending this time with us. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and we'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. Share how this story made you feel, or tell us about someone who changed your life. Your voice matters here, and we can't wait to connect with you. See you in the next story.